I find that a lot of podcasts forget to start with just the name of the podcast and what it's about.
Yeah, did we settle on the name? Are we going to go for...
Was it Screens of the Stone Age?
Screens of the Stone Age. Does that sound like a good name?
I like it. Yeah, I like it.
Welcome to the first episode of Screens of the Stone Age. My name is Josh Lindell. I am a grad student studying Neanderthal teeth. I guess that's a good introduction for myself. And my co-hosts are...
I'm Dr. Kimberly Pomp. I'm a postdoc at Simon Fraser University, and I study skeletal variation and how it impacts our health.
And I'm Dr. Ross Barnett. I study ancient DNA, particularly of Pleistocene, that's Ice Age animals.
So what's the premise of this podcast? We're reviewing movies that have to do with ancient humans or paleoanthropology or...
Pleistocene life.
Anything of that sort. The movie that we decided to review for our first episode is William from 2019. Do either of you want to give a brief summary of that movie?
Kim?
I shouldn't be the one to summarize it because I did not like it.
Okay. Well, I kind of liked it. I thought, they obviously didn't have much of a budget. They tried hard, I think, to at least get some parts appear realistic. There was definitely a story there. Some of the writing was pretty good, I thought. And, I don't think they succeeded in everything they were trying to do, but no. But you could see that they were actually trying to do something.
Yeah, it was a good premise. So should we explain the story, though? What is it? If someone's going to sit down and watch William, what are they going to see?
We should say spoiler alert.
Right,
if anybody's going to be listening to this podcast, probably recommend that everybody watches the movie that we were talking about beforehand.
Yeah. So I don't know what you guys thought, but it felt like it kind of riffed quite heavily on some of the work that I've heard about, like the real work in kind of ancient DNA as a field, looking at genetics of extinct species and things like that. So overall, the whole thing was basically a kind of up-to-date adaptation, I thought, of the quite famous Isaac Asimov story, the Ugly Little Boy, which I'm sure you probably both read.
I have not read it.
I have the PDF of that book in a folder that's been sitting there for a long time, and I haven't got around to reading it yet. Okay,
yeah, no, and it's a great story, but I mean, the sort of shared premise is, what would happen if we brought a Neanderthal child into the modern world? Would we see it as human? Would we see it as other? How much of the sort of separation between Neanderthals and humans is nature? How much is nurture? And I think that is a really kind of good premise for any kind of art, whether it's, film or literature or whatever. And so these guys kind of jumped in with a kind of sci-fi imagining where they kind of looked at some real science, like you can get DNA from Neanderthals. That's not a big deal anymore. People have got a lot of DNA from Neanderthals, complete genomes. And then they kind of mix that in with ideas of cloning, which is also kind of real science. They do a good job of explaining the technique of somatic cell nuclear transplants, which is what has been used for Dolly the Sheep and various other kind of mammalian clonings. And then they kind of mix in some very dubious kind of interpersonal relationships between academics to kind of introduce this idea of a kind of brilliance, though there's not really any sign of how brilliant he is in anything he does. This the main character, whose name I've already forgotten, because I watched this film a few days ago now. But he encourages his other main character, whose name I've also forgotten, to scold him.
I don't know either. It's just William to me.
Crazy academic professor and crazy medical doctor.
The father.
Yeah, the father and the mother.
The father and the mother.
And he kind of encourages her to break every kind of ethical boundary known to any kind of academic research and carry the Neanderthal embryo that they've created to term. And this is William, who's the sort of subject of the film. So I think it's quite a good grounding for these kind of discussions. But yeah, obviously, I think we should open up to you guys to discuss, what you absolutely hated about it.
I honestly didn't have any issue with much of the science, and even the stuff that they kind of got wrong or ignored with Neanderthals was fine to do that for the movie, right? Like, you still need to make a movie work. I just didn't really like the egotistical dad being somewhat, fairly abusive to to William and how it just seemed all, I think one thing that really got me was when the mother was finally taking William out of the lab, and he said something like, "What happened to my brilliant wife or my brilliant partner?" And it just really got to me. Like, it just showed I don't know if, I'm sure that there are scientists like this, but it just really made this, like, there was this huge distinction between science and morals and ethics and humanity. And I don't think that it needed to be that distinct. I think they could have had it be more of a coming to age story about William and less so about the complicated relationship with his dad.
Yeah. It does seem like always in films like this, they want to portray the sort of cold scientific character as the baddie. Whereas, I mean, I don't know any scientists that are even slightly like that. They're all kind of, most of the scientists I know are kind of very warm, personable.
They're just regular people.
Social interactors.
The dad didn't seem to have very much, if any, emotional attachment to William. Like, there was one part that struck me was when William was about 5, I think, and he said, "I love you, Dad." And the dad said, "I'm so proud of everything that you are and could be." Mm. And that is a really sweet thing to hear from your dad, but it felt again that it was, "I'm happy with what you represent about my career and my brain." And he never said, "I love you back" or anything like that. I don't know. It made me angry.
When I'm watching movies with my friends, everybody hates that I always want to pick out all the nitpicky little mistakes. So let's go around and see if we all took some notes and have any mistakes that stood out to us. And let's do this all rapid fire to get out of the way real quick. So Kim, you want to start with one?
I've got one, and I think that it's one that they could have really paid more attention to, and then it would have helped them lay out the plot for the nature versus nurture idea later. And it's the difference in the shape of the brain and the cranium between modern humans and Neanderthals. And we have a very, bulbous shaped head, whereas a Neanderthal's head is a lot more elongated from front to back, and it's more of a football shape. And our foreheads go straight up. So from our eyebrows up, you have this, vertical wall, whereas other hominins, other primates, other animals it goes back from their brows. So if you look at a chimpanzee or an ape or something, the cranium, their frontal bone doesn't go up and down, it goes back. And that's because humans have a very well-developed frontal cortex. The frontal cortex is where you have the abstract thoughts and emotions and all that stuff, and that's why lobotomies make you into a zombie, because they scratch out the frontal lobe, and so you lose that ability. And they hinted towards that with William's inability to grasp metaphors or symbolism. They kind of made it obvious, they're making it obvious that he had issues with this abstract thought idea, which would make sense, because that's, a lot of people think that was one difference between us, since they don't seem to have the same development in the frontal lobe. But I think that they could have gotten that around that, such an important difference between us and Neanderthals, that they could have done it from right when he was born, because the shape of the human cranium, our human pelvis, the female pelvis, and the pelvic inlet, so the space at the bottom of the pelvis where the baby would emerge from, it's such a tight fit already. That's why giving birth is such a dangerous thing, and it was such a high mortality rate for most of human history before medical intervention, is because quite often the baby would get stuck in the birth canal and both mother and child would die. So we have such a tight squeeze already. If a modern human female were to give birth to a Neanderthal baby, I'm not sure that it would fit out of the birth canal. People have done some studies, and there's been some people saying that it might, and some people say that it wouldn't. But they found that Neanderthal babies seem to have about the same size, same developmental size brain and head as modern humans when they're born. So I just don't think, I think it would have been delivered by C-section. I think they could have brought in the discussion about the difference in cranial frontal shape, and then that would have allowed the viewer to understand why he was seeming to struggle with metaphor and abstract thought and all. I think that could have been a very nice linear way of describing it. And yeah, I don't think she would have. I mean, how many people do we know now that are having C-sections and they're giving birth to modern human babies that are adapted to get through that birth canal? I think she would have had to have a C-section.
And it's weird that they kind of suggested that she wasn't having a C-section, and she was just there, holding his hand. and screaming very loudly, whereas they could have, like you say, done a nice sort of segue into rushing her in for an epidural for a C-section, and then they could have explained all that stuff and made it a bit, shown they thought about it a bit more.
Yeah. And then that would have explained, because somebody who's maybe doesn't know much about the differences in brain morphology, which a lot of people watching movies, just choosing something to watch, wouldn't.
Yeah.
They may not understand what they're trying to grasp at with that lack of symbolism, and he just doesn't get the need for metaphor.
Weirdly, he doesn't understand metaphor, but he's fine at being an actor, which
yes,
kind of also struck me a little bit as. But if I could sort of stick in some kind of DNA comments that I had after Kim's kind of paleoanthropology expert viewpoint. So there are some quite weird things in terms of, where the original William had come from. So they kind of suggest that he's a bog body, which is fine. I mean, there are bog bodies, and when they kind of show the original William towards the end, he's kind of clearly modelled on the famous Tolland man from I think from Denmark. He's got the same kind of pose and the same kind of tan skin structure. But I mean, the thing with bog bodies, there's a few things. First of all, is that bogs are terrible for DNA because they're quite acid, and so you don't tend to find many papers that have been published on specimens that have come out of bogs because the DNA is all messed up. It's no good. We
should probably say to the listeners right now, too, is that we don't have a mummy of Neanderthals. That was fictional.
Yeah.
Right. So we do have bog bodies of modern humans, but the flesh Neanderthal that they found, that's fictional. We only have fossils.
And that's a big kind of leap of faith to think that they'd have that. It's also, I mean, we've got no soft tissue of Neanderthals at all, even though we've got soft tissue of things that were alive at the time of Neanderthals, like mammoths and woolly rhinos and cave lions and things like that. But also, most of those mummies aren't from bogs, they're from permafrost, which is very different. Most bogs, especially in the kind of Eurasia where Neanderthals' home range was, they're mostly Holocene. I think there are some bogs that are kind of Pleistocene in age, but they're very few. And, the kind of idea of getting mummies from bogs is very much a kind of Holocene thing. It doesn't go back far enough for Neanderthals. And then, I mean, that kind of brings up another question. Why, if you have, this incredibly unique specimen, a mummified Neanderthal, which must have come from somewhere in kind of Western Eurasia, how the fuck did it end up in an American institution? That's a really, that kind of really took you out of the film. And that would have, there's no way any European country would have allowed that to leave where it had been discovered.
No, exactly.
You can see that if you kind of look at the situation with Otzi, who was found on the kind of, I think, Swiss-Italian border in the Alps. This, is he Bronze Age, Iron Age? Anyway, he's quite a young mummy.
It's Bronze Age, I think. No, Iron Age. No, Bronze. The first one.
This Metal Age mummy. There's been like massive kind of international wranglings over who gets to keep him. I mean, first of all, nobody wanted him because they thought it was like a murder victim and it was going to be expensive to look after. And then since it became like a really interesting specimen that told us a lot about that time period, now there's been kind of lawsuits and counter lawsuits about who gets to keep him because the museum is quite a big kind of earner for whoever has the mummy. So that was the kind of DNA stuff that I thought kind of jumped out at the beginning. But there was some good stuff. I mean, they had good descriptions of how you do kind of cloning, this technique of somatic cell nuclear transfer. But that doesn't kind of get over the fact that however good the DNA is preserved, it's not going to be all in one piece. It'll be broken up because it's got to be at least 30,000 years old if it's from a Neanderthal. And that doesn't work for somatic cell nuclear transfer. You have to have living, viable cells for that to work.
Right.
They also had some nice shots of actual PCR electrophoresis tanks, which I thought was quite a nice touch. That's one of the kind of standards of any kind of molecular biology lab. They kind of glossed incredibly over any bioethics. Nobody really, I mean, most universities would have a bioethicist for this kind of research, definitely, to say what you can and can't do. And that was noticeably lacking.
The idea was, I think, that they just ignored them, right? He said, let's just do it.
Yeah, totally.
Which I don't think a university would ever just lay over and take that.
No.
My understanding was that they did have a sort of ethics review, but it was just one guy calling his friends and asking what they thought, But I was happy that in the end they rejected them. They said they couldn't do it, but then they did it anyway secretly, and then they didn't tell them until William was born. So that's how they got around it. I like that part of it because that's exactly what it would take, because it would never pass ethics review in real life.
No.
Never.
I actually did have a question about the DNA, Ross, for you.
Yeah.
So they talked about how the reason why the cloning didn't work in the sheep, in Dolly, why they died young and everything. And they said it was because they were able to get the mitochondrial DNA from William as opposed to the sheep. And that didn't make sense to me.
No, it didn't. You're right. That was just nonsense. That was just throwing some. That was just throwing some. I mean, mitochondrial DNA is not going to, where you get it from is not going to affect the viability of your clones. It's to do with the damage that the actual nucleus will have gone through it.
Right.
Being part of a somatic tissue. And in William's case, having been in the ground for 30,000 years, that kind of damage. But it did sound quite sciencey, and so
it did, yes. Because the mitochondrial DNA it's easier to get the mitochondrial than nuclear, right? Because there's more of it.
Yeah, but it's just a tiny. I mean, mitochondrial DNA is like 16,000 base pairs. All it does is code for some proteins that help with kind of metabolism.
Right. Yeah.
The nuclear DNA is the kind of 3 billion base pairs of DNA that codes for everything else. That's what you need. But I'm sure, like, Neanderthal nuclear DNA would work perfectly fine with human mitochondrial DNA. But whether you mix and match, that's not going to affect the viability at all. But it does sound sciencey, so that's probably why they put it in.
Right, yes. Cool.
On the note of cloning, I don't think they stated explicitly in the movie, but I was trying to figure out how this aligns with, like, the real-life timeline, and I think the movie was made in 2019, and William was 18 years old at the time. And I think if you look closely, there's a lot of evidence that says that when they're actually doing the cloning, it was 2001. There's a lot of little hints, but they never say it explicitly.
That's before the Neanderthal nuclear genome was published. I mean, the first mitochondrial DNA for Neanderthal is 97, and you only get a few hundred base pairs until I think it's 2006 or 7 that the first Neanderthal genome came out. So
that would be maybe why they used the mummy, because that would be a better explanation of why if you forget about the bog peat stuff, that would be why they were able to get it. Do you think?
But so this would have been around the time when cloning was like brand new and really exciting, and I was still in high school at the time, so I probably wasn't following as closely as I would have now. But my understanding is that Dolly the Sheep was cloned in 1997. And if this movie's set in 2001, when the reporter asks, don't most clones die? The reporter asks him, and he says, we've solved that. But Dolly was still alive in 2001, wasn't she? Dolly lived to be 7 years old, and she died of cancer that was unrelated to the cloning process, didn't she?
Yeah. So,
but she was the only one, right?
Yeah, they did so many implantations for Dolly, I think like 300 or something, and they only had one kind of viable to birth sheep, which was Dolly. And hopefully science has moved on since then, but she's called Dolly because she's produced from mammary gland tissue. So she's named after Dolly Parton, which is something only discovered recently. And, that's...
Oh, I had no idea.
It's a bit skeevy, I think. So, yeah. And I think she did have some issues, but certainly other cloning attempts. So there's quite I think about 2001. So about that kind of time, they attempted to clone something called the Bucardo, the Pyrenean Ibex, which is now extinct. So it's a subspecies of goat that lived in the Pyrenees between France and Spain. And the last one died at the beginning of the millennium, so year 2000, and they stored some of its tissue and tried to produce clones of it from that. And they had the same kind of issues that these guys are bringing up, that a lot of the time, because the nuclear DNA is damaged, and in living cells, nuclear DNA damage tends to lead to things like cancers. That's what cancer is essentially, is big damaged mutations in nuclear DNA. And so with the case of Bucardo, the viable clone that they were able to produce only lived for a couple of hours because it had, I think, some major lung abnormalities and basically kind of drowned in its own lung fluid.
Aww.
Yeah, it's a shame. So, I mean, the Bucardo is the only species that's gone extinct twice, which is quite neat.
That's a good trivia, I think.
But the actual process of somatic cell nuclear transfer cloning does tend to lead to a lot of large issues with living animals.
Interesting.
Which is something that could have been a strand of the film if they wanted to go in that direction. You know, you can't sort of step into the same river twice. If you bring back a Neanderthal, it's going to be kind of riddled with cancer and maybe have sort of long-term health issues.
Yeah, which they didn't bring up with William at all. His issues were more father-related.
He was super sexy with his big eyebrows.
Yeah.
Early on, they did make a big deal of keeping him in a sterile room because he wouldn't have had adaptations to modern pathogens. But then I guess his mother's love just sort of solved that because he was dying and then she went in and hugged him and then it was never a problem for the rest of his life. So
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah.
And that's another kind of interesting kind of thing that they could have brought up. I mean, a lot of, I guess, human immunity is adaptive. It depends on kind of early exposure to the pathogens that are in the environment. So they might have actually been harming him by keeping him in sterile environments. I mean, there's nothing so different. Well, there isn't, but it could be that what he needed was, as well as his mother's love, was just some exposure to some normal, everyday kind of bacteria and bugs on the outside world.
Yeah.
One of the first things that I was thinking about as I was watching this movie is a story going back to 2013. I have the headline open from Fox News website here. Scientist seeks quote-unquote adventurous woman to have Neanderthal baby. Do you guys remember this story?
Yes. I was going to sign up for it. I think Ross talked me out of it.
That doesn't sound like me.
So this story was going around the news outlets for a week or two. Everyone was reporting that a scientist was looking for a woman to do exactly this, to clone a Neanderthal baby and raise it.
Yeah.
And of course, the original interview was done in German and then something was lost in translation. He had to come out a couple of days later and correct and say, I'm not looking for a woman to carry a Neanderthal baby. I'm just saying it's theoretically possible. Because, of course, it would not pass review. But this is the first thing that I was thinking about. And then the next thing, of course, I was thinking about the cases from the 70s and 80s, I think, of people trying to raise chimpanzees as human children to try and teach them language. And I think that there's probably a lot of parallels in that one as well.
They've actually been able to do a three-dimensional reconstruction of what they think the Neanderthal vocal cords would have been like based on the skeletal anatomy of their throat and head. And they think that they were able to make some noises, but not to the same variations in frequencies as us. So they would still be able to make some noises, but not as many as us. And again, I think they tried to show that with William in the way that he would just say like, no, yes, but then he still had the full range of human noises. But I don't know how you'd make that in a movie and make it good without making it seem like you're trying to make him
like a stereotypical cave person, like they talk about.
Like a stereotypical, yeah. When they very likely had their own language and everything. It's just not. It wouldn't sound the same as ours.
It's really interesting how kind of literature kind of approaches the kind of question of Neanderthal language. Like, I mean, I've read a few. I'm sure you guys have too. I've read a few kind of paleofictions, kind of classic John Rule,
like
exactly, the classic. But also, William Golding's The Inheritors and Bjorn Curtin's Dance of the Tiger. And I think it's William Golding in The Inheritors. He gave the Neanderthals like less plasticity of speech than modern humans, but introduces the idea that they can use sort of sign language really well, and that's something that's evolved in Neanderthals. And so their language is a mix of kind of spoken and gestural language, which I thought was quite neat. And that's something that might actually lend itself quite well to film, if that's something they wanted to do. Yes,
exactly. And, it could have very well been that way if we look at other animals, especially other primates. A lot of their communication is body language and signals.
Yeah. Well,
so it would make sense.
Even modern humans.
Again, it would make sense that we're the abnormal ones. Yeah, and modern human. Yeah. Have you guys seen when they reconstructed the noise that mummy would make? You have to Google that. It's so funny. It's just like a...
There's some kind of YouTube clip I've seen of them where they've kind of reconstructed the kind of vocal tracts of Neanderthals, and it's some kind of voice teacher, like a singing teacher, and she's got one of her students to come in and try and replicate what Neanderthals would sound like, and it's absolutely hilarious. I mean, it's just it's got viral content written all over it.
It's a BBC production, I believe, and I was thinking about exactly the same thing. She tells him to raise his voice up an octave and talk through his nose, and it sounds just totally ridiculous.
Oh dear.
So in the early in the movie, when the two scientists are meeting for the first time over beers to talk about this idea,
that was the first thing that pissed me off.
I've got my notes from that. I've got
first his assumption she's a grad student.
Yeah, that's exactly what I put. I assumed that she was a grad student.
Assumption she's a grad student, then disparaging at the fact that she's a grad student with an opinion, which is completely ridiculous, and I've never had a professor act like that. And also, grad students are usually where the innovative ideas and like they're pushing the field forward. And it felt a bit sexist.
A lot sexist.
It felt ageist. Yeah, okay, good. I didn't want to like play that card.
And really unethical. I mean, that's not how supervisors should behave.
Because he was pretty much like, you're a grad student, don't even talk to me. And then she said, I'm not a grad student, I'm an adult with my own career and mind.
A medical doctor, no less.
And then he was like, oh, have some wine. And I was like, oh, it was just bad.
It was quite, bad, I think is the word for it. But it's good that we've all recognized that that's not something that goes on in real life academia, hopefully.
No, I mean, even then I was like, this is what you're always warned about as a female in academia. I've never had it happen, but it just seems, you're just like, ew, you know? Like right away, at no point in time did he think, I'll listen to your opinions and you want to talk to me about science with no other, aim.
He wasn't interested in any of her kind of research ideas until after they were shagging, basically. Is what I took from it, which was, that's not good.
And then he took her research ideas and then went running and then tried to make it so she had no say over it.
Another thing I thought was quite interesting as well, when they're describing it, I've just got all my notes in kind of chronological order from the film, but just after it says, creepy professor, and, assumed she's a grad student, they're saying like how he's a rock star academic and he's got his own space. He had a lot of space that didn't seem to be doing anything in his labs, I noticed. But then he says, 3 papers in 2 years. I was like, whoa.
Yeah, I know. I thought that too.
3 papers in 2 years. I mean, I haven't got an academic position and I've managed to be on sort of 8 papers in the past 2 years. So, I mean... Well,
you're pretty good. You're pretty darn good.
a lot of hitchhiking.
Well, she said it was 3 landmark papers. So I'm not sure if he's written a few other non-landmark papers. But in my experience, that's not how we describe ourselves or other people. I would never say, this is Dr. Ross, he's written 1 landmark publication, and the rest were shit, right? Like,
accurate as that would be, that's not how you would describe me.
That's not how, so it just, I don't think that is, I think he did 3 papers, and it was 3 papers from the lab, too, so not even just him. Yeah.
This was before William was born that this scene was taking place, and of course, after this problematic first encounter, they go on to get married and have a Neanderthal baby together. And then 18 years later, they're divorced, and when William goes to live with his father again, he finds out that his father is shacking up with
a young grad student. Yes. I know, it's so played into it.
He's got a modus operandi, I think. I mean, it's clear he's not a good dude. But what was interesting is that they got married by Elvis, which I thought, maybe I was reading too much into it, but I thought, here they've gone to Vegas to get married. Elvis, famously dead, but everyone sees him as being alive. And there's actually a really good book by a woman called Helen Pilcher called "Bring Back the King," which is all about the science of ancient DNA and cloning, and it uses how feasible would it be to bring back Elvis using ancient DNA? How feasible would it be to bring back a Neanderthal? How feasible would it be to bring back Tyrannosaurus Rex? So I thought maybe I was reading too much into it, but the idea of getting married by Elvis in a film about bringing the dead back to life, I thought was quite a nice touch.
Yeah. Well, even if they didn't mean that, then they'll probably pretend they did now.
I hadn't thought about that Elvis angle, but it did strike me as odd that they felt the need to get married just so they could have a baby. But then they explained later that the reason that they went to Nevada was because it's not illegal to clone human embryos in Nevada specifically. And I had to look that up later, but it seems like quite a few American states don't have any laws about human cloning.
I think that's like a byproduct of the kind of Bush era when the kind of stem cell legislation came in, and I, obviously as a kind of British outsider, I don't quite understand all the kind of nuances, but yeah, it seems it comes down to kind of federal states issue, and anytime anyone wants to get federal, you'll always have like a kind of cohort of states saying, well, we're going to do it differently. And Nevada seems to be one of those guys that's always like that.
Yeah, Nevada, Arizona, Texas. Arizona doesn't even do daylight savings time. They just refuse, which is good.
Okay.
I don't know.
And did anyone know so when they were doing the play, like Williams in a play where he's not struggling with metaphor, acting as a pirate or something, is that a real play? So I couldn't find any. I thought it might have been the Pirates of Penzance or something, but I kind of Googled a few of the lyrics.
It was a colonial thing. No, it didn't recognize. They probably would have had to pay some kind of...
Yeah, that's a good point.
Copyright thing.
Going back to the problematic bar scene, one of the things that I wonder if you caught was that when they're drawing out their little diagrams as they're talking, he's writing on a manuscript that has the title "A Draft Sequence of the Neanderthal Genome," which of course is the title of the 2010 paper by Green et al. That published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. And this was supposed to be set in roughly 2001-ish, I think. So I thought it was interesting that they were taking, the real life papers. Title and implying that these are, in this alternate universe, this is that team, and because they have the bog body, now they're the ones publishing the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome.
Interesting. I'll have to ask Ed Green what he thinks about that, and see what he says. But that's quite a nice touch. I mean, there were quite a few nice touches like that where it showed that somebody had done their homework.
Yeah. I think that the intention was really good. I think they just they almost tried to fit in too many stories and too many, they tried to make it too many different movies, and then they kind of lost it on all of them.
Let's talk about what this movie is actually about, and I think it's about at least like 3 different things that can be each divided into 2 different things, and none of those things are a sci-fi movie about Neanderthals at all. Like, it's not really about William, it's kind of about everybody else.
Yeah, he doesn't express very many opinions or feelings at all, except for being bullied by his dad and feeling a bit uncomfortable. But, I mean, when he was with school and stuff, he seemed fine. So he was more just uncomfortable when he tried to learn more about Neanderthals, and then made him feel like an outsider.
I think the movie very quickly, it starts off with the message, if you could raise the question of if you could raise a Neanderthal in a modern human society, would it be like a modern human, or would it be a totally different animal? And then they very quickly establish, he's essentially a modern human, but he's, maybe slightly, neuroatypical or something like that. And then that question isn't brought up anymore. After that, it's all about everything else. So yeah, Kim, you've already talked about there's this story about the relationship between a father and his son, and that doesn't really resolve well because he doesn't really learn any lesson at all. He's just terrible right to the end, so that nothing comes out of that. But then that also is sort of mixed up with the question of scientific ethics, where he's just sort of a mad scientist who is at odds with the rest of society, and his partner and wife and mother of William has the ethical moral concerns for William, and he's only worried about scientific breakthroughs,
which is an archetype that goes like straight back to Victor Frankenstein. I mean, that's exactly the same kind of non-arc that goes on there. I mean,
and there was a mention of Shelley, what is it? What's her name? Mary Shelley, yeah. The lady, the Neanderthal expert, said I'm uncomfortable with the Mary Shelleyness of the work. Yeah, somebody was big on symbolism.
The movie takes a pretty strong side that this was all bad, and the ostensible main character, Dr. Julian. He has a real name. We should have established these at the beginning. Dr. Julian Reed was the father, and Dr. Sorry, I'm scrolling through IMDb. Dr. Barbara Sullivan was the mother, and Dr. Julian Reed was the father. So obviously, Dr. Julian Reed was just across the board bad father and across the board unethical scientist, and the mother was just exactly the opposite to that, and there's no real change in either of those characters any of the way through the movie.
What I found really interesting was how, so it starts with Dr. Julian saying everybody thought Neanderthals were brutish, aggressive, beasts or whatever. And then he says they probably aren't. Let's make one and see. So they make William, and he's not, obviously. But then at the end, the father has treated him so poorly and hurt him so badly that in the end, William does punch his dad, probably in a way that's not abnormal for teenage boys and fathers who are fighting.
But with a nice hand axe.
But because he's a Neanderthal, he's strong. Yes, with a hand axe in his hand,
nice.
And he's stronger than modern humans. And then, it ends with him being chased by the cops. And so it's almost like the father was going to prove that Neanderthals weren't these rugged, aggressive beasts, and then made William, he didn't make William into that. William's still the person that he is. He's still a nice person, but he made him feel that way and made it so the rest of the world was going to see him that way. Because I don't think normally they would have cops chasing a person just for punching somebody. They'd be looking for him, but they wouldn't have that SWAT team type take him down. So I feel like they were doing that because they don't know he's an outsider. They don't know how he's going to react. And so it's almost like the doctor himself ruined his own
creation.
Hypothesis.
Which is the Frankenstein story again, isn't it? The monster starts off, perfectly fine, but he's treated so badly that he ends up being the monster that everyone thinks he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've given away the spoilers at the ending. What happens is William...
Well, we said no spoilers.
We said spoilers for sure.
Oh, we said
go
spoilers,
watch the
right,
movie,
yes.
There's going to be spoilers. So at the end of the movie, he confronts his father, and he's upset, and he's holding... it's an Acheulean hand axe, which is not a Neanderthal
I know,
tool.
yes, that drove me nuts, too.
That's like a Homo erectus,
yeah.
That's a million-year-old tool, where he should be holding some sort of Mousterian flake or something, but... Mm-hmm. So he lashes out at his father and ends up knocking him unconscious, or I don't know, he's bleeding on the ground. They don't resolve that. But then on IMDb and all over the internet, everybody hates the ending because they say it's such an American ending, because what happens is the police go after him and gun him down and he dies.
Oh, I missed that.
Well, that's what's implied, right?
Oh.
So
yeah, I just thought they had tackled him.
It's my interpretation, and everybody else on IMDb, is that this is the police gunning down an innocent person because of the perception that he is something that he's not, which is where this movie ties into a metaphor for racism. And there's quite a few points where this is, like, they lead up to this quite a bit. So I don't know if you noticed... when there's a scene when he's a young boy and he's being bullied by a bunch of other boys because he's different, and they attack him and he defends himself, and they're at a police station and the mother of the other boys is saying horrible things about how he's not a human and he's an animal and he deserves to be locked up. Mm. And the police officer dealing with that is black, and he's basically, brushing her off, saying, I'm not going to deal with this. And then at a later scene, when he's a teenager, he walks into a shop and there's two white girls at the counter, and they look at him and giggle and then leave. And then the shop owner is Indian, and he looks over at William and they sort of share a look, and he calls them bitches or something. Mm. So throughout the movie, they had him, people treating him badly because he's different as a metaphor for racism. And then at the end, of course, he's killed by police officers when he was not armed and not a threat to them, which is a pretty clear... I watched an interview with the writer and the director, and he makes it pretty clear that he wanted this to be at least partly a metaphor for racism and how we treat people who are different. But then on the other side of that, it's also a metaphor for autism, a little less explicitly, but the fact that he has trouble with metaphors and symbolism and things like this, and he's very literal in his interpretations of things. So I feel like they're sort of mixing their metaphors here, and this is one of the things that sort of dilutes the message and makes it feel like it lacks focus.
Yeah, I think, like Kim said, it tried to do too much, and any one of those issues on their own, it needs to be taken seriously and done in a kind of sensitive and well-executed way for it to be accepted as a good metaphor. And I don't think this movie had that, essentially. I mean, it didn't follow through with it. I mean, it may have set up all these things as, metaphors, racism or neurotypical, all these kind of different ideas, but it didn't consistently handle them all the way through the film to make them a good handling, I think. It just touched on them and then moved off in a different direction, and that's not how to treat it. That's not how to treat something as serious as this, sensitively and well, I would say.
Yeah, agreed.
We should maybe talk a bit about the ending as well. The ending with the grad student whose name I've forgotten as well, turning up with the baby.
Oh yeah.
It came a bit out of nowhere. Yes, they were kind of getting frisky in the forest, but
I thought they just kissed.
I mean that's what I thought as well. And then suddenly she turns up with this massive eyebrowed baby at the original bog, which looks suspiciously like the Pacific Northwest.
Oh yes, that's what I was going to say at the beginning, and I totally forgot, is that it's actually filmed in Vancouver, and it's filmed on an island just off of downtown Vancouver, and it's where, I don't know if you remember the pictures of my Facebook, but that's where I spent the first couple of weeks of quarantine last March. So it's cool. It's called Bowen Island, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and it does look like that, and the houses are that gorgeous, and just watching it made me go, I wish I was there.
Does a good thing for Vancouver tourism. I think it sells it as a nice place to visit, and really kind of beautiful space.
So it's filmed in Vancouver, but I believe it's set in Seattle, right? I
think so, yeah. Because I got the idea that it was Weston University, but it kind of seemed like Washington University.
Throughout the movie, they're always reflecting back to this image of the trench where he was supposed to have been excavated from, and the surrounding area looks exactly like the Pacific Northwest. Yeah. So I never got, like, were they implying that this Neanderthal bog body was dug up in the Pacific Northwest, or was it just a low budget just filming at the same location? Because, as you said, the grad student with William's baby at the end ends up at the same bog. So did she travel to Europe to find this location, or was he just dug up outside of his father's original house on some Pacific Northwest island?
I think they should have made that a bit clearer, because it does kind of impact quite a big bit onto the kind of what you take away from it. I mean, they seem like they've done enough research that they wouldn't have thought you could have dug up a Neanderthal in Vancouver. Although, that trench is suspiciously small. I mean, that's not 40,000 years of sediment on top of there. I mean, I'm not an archaeologist, but I recognize that that's way too shallow. But yeah, I guess I thought that they were going for her kind of traveling back to the baby's father's roots in Eurasia somewhere, even though it did look like it was just an hour outside of Vancouver. But that's what I hope for. Because when they kind of showed, I think they showed like a flashback of William, the Neanderthal, the original one, alive in the kind of marshy area, which also looked like the Pacific Northwest. So I think they were kind of just hoping to stretch their budget by showing, but I don't know.
See, I watched it on YouTube, so maybe it cut off early, because I saw her with the baby, but I didn't see the live Neanderthal.
Well, that was earlier in the film, I think. That was when they were discussing William the bog body, I think. There was a bit, but I could have, I mean, because it's all filmed in the same area, it might have just been when William was out on his own, I don't know. My kind of takeaway from the ending was it was quite a kind of chaste kiss that they had, as kind of weirdly, incestuous and unethical it was for his dad's girlfriend to be kissing his Neanderthal child son as a teenager that she was trying to teach maths.
I was really happy about it, though.
Were you?
Yeah, she was too old, but I just thought it was, take that.
Yeah, and certainly it showed him.
Stupid father.
But then, my kind of take home from it was that she was traveling to her baby's kind of historical homelands in Eurasia somewhere to show him something about something. I mean, yeah, again, it's one of these things that you could sort of see where they were going for, but it didn't quite land. And if they'd just done a bit more exposition or had her say something, like, this is where you're from, baby, whatever, then that could have made it a bit clearer.
They should have done a few more drafts of the screenplay, right? Or the script. If they'd gone over it a bit more, that might have come together a bit better.
How about you, Josh? Did you have a kind of takeaway from the ending?
Yeah, the sort of the personal journey of William himself throughout the movie was trying to find his place in society, which he never did. But at the end, before he confronts his father, he found the archaeologist who had actually excavated the remains from which he was cloned, who was, I don't know if she was a mentor to his father or something like that. But he met her at the university, and she showed him the actual bog body remains. And I really liked the conversation they had, because he was trying to get some sense of where he came from, and she was giving him very honest answers. And he asked what happened to the Neanderthals, and she discussed theories about why the Neanderthals had gone extinct, and she said something about how they had been forced into less advantageous habitat by the superior numbers of modern humans. And then at the end of that encounter, she was asking him about how he feels like or where he feels like he belongs, or what he's feeling. And he turned that around on her and he said, "I feel like I've been forced into a less advantageous habitat by your superior numbers." And so maybe the grad student taking his child back to his homeland is some sense of trying to raise him with a proper sense of where he belongs, rather than being raised in a lab like William was for the first few years of his life.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. She was really good, that actor, that Beth Grant, I think is her name. The one that was the mentor that has the conversation. That was one of the best bits of the film, I thought, their kind of discussion together. And I think she was...
Yeah, agreed.
She's been in quite a few films, but I don't think she's actually on the IMDb page for the film, weirdly.
She's usually in comedies, isn't she?
I think she was the I Doubt Your Commitment to Sparkle Motion woman from Donnie Darko. I think that's where I first saw her. But yeah, she was really good.
To sort of wrap up with our feelings for the general message of the movie and how it portrays sciences and archaeology and paleoanthropology, how do you feel about the way it portrayed the science? Was it accurate? Does it give a good impression for the public of what this field actually is and what it means to people?
I feel like it was very little to do with actual paleoanthropology and more to do with the genetics and this biological science on that end. They didn't really actually talk much about the paleoanthropology or the fossil record. What I appreciated with it is that it showed that Neanderthals were very likely very similar to us. And they very likely had, culture and language and symbolism, and they had that same. So it didn't live up to that same idea of modern Homo sapiens being, necessarily better than or anything, just different. And we just happened to be the ones to survive. So I appreciated that, because a lot of times, with undergrads and stuff, they come in with this idea of Neanderthals, just like the horrible professor says, is that, for a lot of decades, what the public saw of Neanderthals was brutish, I guess, and probably dumb and slow and all that, and it's just not true. There's no reason to think that.
Neanderthals come out really well from this film, and it's modern humans that come out pretty badly. There's not really many good examples of Homo sapiens in the film, but William himself is very, very likable and very charismatic, I guess, as a ambassador for Neanderthals as a whole.
Well, I think he was pretty popular at school. I think his main problem with fitting in was because of the abusive relationship with his dad, which I think is probably what a lot of people feel, whether they're modern human or not, right?
I think in some sense that this relates to a potential perception of what archaeology and paleoanthropology is for, which is to learn about human origins as a matter of better understanding ourselves. So by both presenting Neanderthals as very human and very sympathetic, but then juxtaposing that to ask us questions about what we are ourselves, I think that's probably a valuable thing to do. One of the things that I didn't like about it is that it presents science as a very individualistic enterprise.
Yes.
Which is very unlike anything. You can't have two scientists come together to clone a Neanderthal. That would be a team effort. That paper would probably have, 50 authors.
Multiple countries and labs and
And then the ethics review board as well was a single guy calling his friends. An ethical review board exists and it's multiple people and it has protocols to do that. So it's always a team effort. And the way, like I said before, if this was going to happen, it would have to be some rogue scientists doing it on their own, but I don't even know if it would be possible for only 2 people to do this without anybody else knowing.
In terms of the kind of genetics, I thought generally they kind of showed they'd done some of their homework, and that the kind of techniques they talked about and the kind of advances they were discussing were mostly kind of based in the real world. Where it didn't ring true at all was in their kind of portrayal of academia, and in the portrayal of scientists, like Josh says, how they operate and how they act. I mean, even the kind of worst scientists as people that I know wouldn't behave as unethically as these people do in the film. But I recognize as well that they have to have that, or else there's not a film. So, you have to kind of have some kind of suspension of disbelief that these horrible characters have to do horrible things for the film to pan out the way they want it to. But yeah, there's some good bits. They kind of talk about PCR. They don't make any kind of obviously stupid mistakes, apart from when they're discussing the kind of nuclear mitochondrial stuff. It sounds like they're just using sciencey words to get over what is the massive issue that you can't actually clone a Neanderthal from fossil DNA. But I think it does a good job of kind of making the science seem exciting, but then it kind of ruins that by having it being done by such horrible people. So swings and roundabouts, I guess.
So any last comments about William before we wrap it up?
No, I think that's good. I mean, the conversation went really smoothly, I think. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. I think William's a good one to start with because it's just bad enough that there's stuff that we can pick up on and talk about.
So what's the next movie then?
Did you have any thoughts for the next movie?
It should be one that maybe catches, that like maybe Encino Man or something that everybody's probably seen, right?
You said Encino Man before, and that's my favorite one on the list, okay. So let's do that.
Let's do that.
It's been years since I watched that.
Yeah, me too.
I watch it every couple of years for sure. I got to keep it fresh. So that'll be it for our first podcast. Next 2 weeks, when these start airing, we'll have Encino Man starring Pauly Shore. It's not a great movie for bringing up in classes anymore because the kids don't know who Pauly Shore is.
Oh,
what?
Man.
They must know who Brendan Fraser is, though, surely.
I don't know. He kind of got canceled by Hollywood like 10 years ago, and he hasn't done much recently either.
Yeah, that's true. But he's in The Mummy as well, another kind of Italian.
Thanks to David Bach for designing our cover art. You can see more of his work at dkbach.com. Screens of the Stone Age is supported by the Paleoanthropological Society of Canada. Find out what Canadian paleoanthropologists are working on at pasc-scpa.ca.